Sicily is an island off the southern coast of Italy. It's renowned for its incredible food, and also, perhaps less gloriously, for being the homeland of the mafia. And you'll have heard of it if you watch The Godfather a few too many times. But the capital of the city is Palermo. And in the beating heart of the old city of Palermo lies an astonishing building. It's the cathedral. And just from the outside, the surprises are everywhere. First of all, the walls are crenellated like some North African fortress. There are parts of it that look like it came straight out of Tunisia. The dome and bell tower proclaim it to be a Catholic Christian church, but the decorated arches with geometric designs and the turquoise and cream tiles, along with the date palms swaying in the courtyard, have a distinctively Eastern flavor. Now, if you go inside, you will be greeted with much newer neoclassical architecture and Greco-Roman style statues. This amazing building is an agglomeration of different cultures that have left their imprint in the heart of Sicily over centuries. This Palermo Cathedral was finished in 1185, but it was built on the site of a pre-existing mosque, which explains some of the architecture. In fact, you can still find an Arabic passage of the Quran engraved on one of the columns inside the church itself. And that mosque was itself built on a much older Greek Orthodox Christian church. And so there are these layers of history and culture that are expressed in the architecture and speak volumes to the people that shaped not only this building, but the history of Sicily. Historian John Julius Norwick describes the history of the Normans in Sicily as, quote, one of the most extraordinary and fascinating epics of European history between the ages of Julius Caesar and Napoleon. And I agree entirely. This is a tale of swashbuckling adventure. It's a tale of ambition, of astonishing twists of fate, and incredible cultural achievements. It takes place during the peak of the Middle Ages, an age of crusaders, kings, vagabonds, and adventurers. This is Villains and Virgins podcast, and you are listening to the first in a series on the Normans in Sicily. Now, before we get started, I'd like to say a special thank you to those of you who have decided to support this podcast on Patreon. On Patreon, I'm working on back scenes content and post-episode Q&A sessions where I'm available to have conversations and answer questions about the makings of these episodes for those people who are part of that Patreon community. If you'd like to know more, you can visit the website, villainsandvirgins.com, or you can go to Patreon/Eva Schubert. The location of Sicily is key to understanding its history. It functions as a bridge between East and West. Many of us reflexively think of Sicily as Italian, and therefore we think of it as Western and Catholic. And that's true, but it's only part of what is true, because Sicily has a far richer and more complex history than you're likely to realize. First of all, you have to realize that Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, is as close to Sicily as Naples is. So Naples is in southern Italy on the mainland. It's very, very close if you're on the island of Sicily, but you don't imagine that North Africa is equally as close. The footprints of Sicily's rich cultural background are visible everywhere, even today. You can wander through the markets, for example, and find the distinctive Moor's Head jugs, which testify to the very long-standing presence of Arabs on the island. It's evident in the foods that make Sicily so distinctive as a culinary tradition. Whether it's the presence of raisin or citrus or almonds that are so characteristic of Sicilian cuisine and make it different from the rest of Italy. And this is in large part because the history of Sicily is so distinct from the rest of Italy. In order to understand who the Normans were and how they came to Sicily, we have to step back and take a look at what sort of a place Sicily was already when the Normans arrived there. So, thumbnail history going way, way back. Sicily is part of the Roman Empire initially. So it's dominated by the likes of Julius Caesar, Octavius, and their successors. So we have an emperor in 286 named Diocletian who divides the empire into an eastern and western half. The western half has its capital in Rome most of the time, and the eastern half has its capital in Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. Now, the western half doesn't last nearly as long. It's collapsed by 476 under waves of barbarian raids, and Italy, for the most part, becomes vulnerable to competing barbarian tribes. We're talking about Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Lombards, and so on, who are all trying to carve out their own piece of territory there. There is no centralized political, administrative, or military administration in Italy at this point, after the Western Empire has collapsed. But this is not true in the eastern half of the empire. The seat of government in Constantinople remains stable for not just a little while, but many centuries after the western half has collapsed. Historians even refer to them now as the Byzantine Empire during this period after the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire. They wouldn't have called themselves Byzantines. In Constantinople, they saw themselves as Romans. Their emperors still wore the purple. And while there were some differences, mainly that the language of administration over time became Greek instead of Latin, they were in many ways an unbroken line of succession from what had been the original Roman Empire, and this continues right into the 820s and afterwards. So Sicily, which you and I now think of as part of Italy, and therefore Western, Latin, Catholic, is actually, from the period of the 500s into the 820s, under the Eastern Roman Empire's control. And so this explains a number of very interesting differences that Sicily and the southern part of Italy have from the rest of the country. Namely, extensive Greek communities in parts of southern Italy like Calabria, and Greek Orthodox Christian churches in Sicily itself. That's because for many centuries, it remained closely connected to the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where Greek was the language of learning and administration. Sicily remains a province of the Byzantine Empire until 827, at which point the Arabs have invaded and started conquering large parts of the island. Given the proximity of Sicily to North Africa, the presence of Arab raiders coming across in ships really shouldn't be that surprising. And when I say North Africa, you might be thinking of Morocco and Tunisia, but you have to remember that places like Libya and Egypt are also North Africa. And many times over the centuries, the politics going on in these countries would spill over and have an effect on people in Sicily, just because of the geographical proximity of these places and how easy it was to get from one to the other on a ship. For example, Christian captives from Sicily were at one point seized by pirates and then brought to the slave markets of Alexandria in Egypt for sale. They were then ransomed by the Christian patriarch of Alexandria. Yes, there were Arab Christians in Egypt, in Alexandria then, as there are now. And so the leader of the Christian community in Alexandria sees these Sicilian Christians in the slave market, and he pays the money to purchase them so that he can set them free. The Byzantines, in turn, from their base in Constantinople, they had, of course, naval bases and fortresses in Sicily as well, because Sicily was part of their territory. And they would launch raids into North Africa, where they would seize wealth and captives. So it went both ways, this ship-borne traffic of seizing goods and people between the territories in the Byzantine Empire and what was going on in North Africa. Some of the earliest Arab raids in Sicily are confirmed by both Christian and Muslim sources and happened as early as the mid-600s, which is really only a few decades after Islam emerges. It's very, very early. Because Sicily was under Byzantine control, these raids from North Africa become a diplomatic issue between the capital of Byzantine government and their negotiations with Muslim governors in what was then called Ifriqiya. Now, Ifriqiya is a name for the formerly Roman province, which was composed of coastal parts of Tunisia, western Libya, and eastern Algeria. So it's an old Roman province name for what we now know as different parts of North Africa. And this area is then under Muslim control, so we can see the Byzantine government negotiating with these new Muslim governors about, how do we deal with this piracy problem that we have in Sicily. It wasn't just about raids, though. I mean, raids were a negotiation issue that had to be dealt with, but there was also a very healthy trade relationship at times between the Byzantine Empire and the Muslims of North Africa. One example of this is an incident that's recorded in the Abbasid court of Ifriqiya. So the Abbasids were a Muslim dynasty that were in control of this part of North Africa. The Byzantine governor of Sicily sends word to the Abbasid governor of Ifriqiya in North Africa, and he says, "I'd like to buy from you copper, iron, and weapons." So it's a trade proposition. The Muslim governor agrees, despite the extremely loud opposition of a religious zealot in his court who went by the name of Bulul ibn Rashid. Now, this zealot, Rashid, even attempted to incite other people in the Abbasid court to side with him against the governor's decision and say no trade with these Sicilians. As a result, Ibn Rashid, the religious fanatic, was executed by the Muslim governor in Ifriqiya, and trade with Sicily was given the green light. The point of this story is just to illustrate that as such close neighbors, the Byzantines and the Arabs sometimes had problems in terms of piracy and raids. Sometimes they traded. But there was this ongoing, constant communication of necessity. And sometimes we even see Sicilians siding with the Arabs against their Byzantine overlords. So one event that decisively shifted the politics in Sicily in a very long-term way gets kicked off because there's a revolt in Sicily against Byzantine authority. Now, there are various stories about what might have instigated this revolt, but the most likely explanation is probably increasingly higher taxes that are being demanded by centralized Byzantine government from the local governors in Sicily, as well as perhaps higher conscription, or even longer-term military commitments that would have taken Byzantine military personnel who had been stationed in Sicily for a long time and moved them elsewhere around the empire on missions that could have lasted years or perhaps indefinitely. So marching orders like that were really unwelcome, especially when you'd gotten comfortable, you'd set up a home, you had property, possibly a wife, in Sicily, and now these orders are coming from central command that threaten to overturn everything. So the Greek governor of Sicily leads this revolt and says, okay, we're not doing what the Byzantines are asking us to do. We want to be independent over here. And fascinatingly, he actually seeks help from his Muslim neighbors in order to liberate himself and his territory from centralized Byzantine command. So what he does is he sends a messenger to the Muslim Aghlabids in Tunisia. And he says, listen, guys, if you send over some soldiers to help us out here so we can fight the Byzantines and liberate ourselves from being ruled by them, then we'll pay tribute to you and we'll acknowledge the Aghlabid ruler as our nominal overlord. So, it'll be a mutually beneficial relationship. You send soldiers and we'll send cash. Just to be clear here, we have a Greek Christian governor in Sicily seeking the help of Muslims from North Africa to fight against the Greek Christian Byzantine Empire and to separate himself from them. That's what's going on here. So the politics get really quite convoluted. Now, the Aghlabid governor in Tunisia, who had problems of his own to deal with, thought that this deal had potential. I mean, he had some troublemakers, some people in his court who were getting a little bit perhaps too ambitious or too uppity, and he thought this is a perfect opportunity to send these malcontents off over to Sicily, where they can fight the Byzantines. Maybe some of them will never come back. At worst, I lose some of my more troublesome people, but at best, I secure a foothold in Sicily and ongoing tribute payments. Sounds like a good deal. So in 827, an army from North Africa under Aglabid Command arrives at the behest of this Greek governor. So the Byzantine rebel, the Greek guy who had invited the Muslim armies in, ends up getting killed in the campaign against his Byzantine overlords that follows. But now you have a North African army in Sicily with the mission of taking it away from the Byzantines. And that mission isn't going anywhere, even though the guy who initially invited them in has died. So the Arab army stays, and their mission now is to take Sicily from the Byzantines and to put it under the control of the Aghlabids, which was the initial mission anyway. There was just supposed to be a Greek intermediary who was going to pay tribute to the Aghlabids. But since he's unfortunately died in the fighting, it's just going to be direct Aghlabid rule if this army fulfills what they've been sent to do. Now, it wasn't an easy mission. It took actually over a century of gradually expanding their control over Sicily. And eventually, the Aghlabids in Tunisia are replaced by a different Muslim dynasty, the Fatimids, who are actually Shia Muslims instead of being Sunni Muslims. So there's not just a change of dynasty, but there's even a change of denomination, if you will. But Arabs in Sicily aren't going anywhere. So by 909, they're under Fatimid control, and by 965, Sicily is the emirate of Sicily. So the entire island is now under Muslim control. Now, under Muslim rule, Christian churches, monasteries, and communities were largely left to continue as usual, provided they paid their taxes. But Sicily itself was transformed in a number of significant ways. Under the Western Roman Empire and then the rule of the Eastern or Byzantine Empire, Sicily had been basically a backwater. It was a grain-producing region. It was largely rural. But when the Arabs came in, they brought new agricultural methods, new irrigation technologies, and a whole bunch of new crops, which became extremely important to the economy and culture of Sicily. For example, they brought in cotton, they brought in sugarcane, they brought in dates, they brought in citrus fruits. And so, in addition to bringing in a profusion of new products, which Sicily was then producing, they also expanded the markets so that in the ports of Messina and Palermo, there were traders from across the Mediterranean coming in. It became a major center of trade. Of course, this period is also the time when mosques are built in Sicily and when permanent changes to some of the architecture occur because of the cultural influences that have arrived directly from North Africa. There's a fantastic story about the Muslim emir of Sicily in this period, in the late 900s. And it goes like this. Apparently, 3 Christian monks had been captured by Arab pirates from the mainland, from southern Italy in Calabria. And they were carried off to Sicily. So the abbot of that monastery in Calabria, a man named Nilus, writes to the emir or the governor of Sicily, and he says, here's some money. I want to ransom my monks back to my monastery. So I'm going to pay you whatever money I need to buy these men and their freedom back so they can return home to me in the monastery. Now, the emir responds very unexpectedly. He sends the men back, the 3 monks, but he also sends back the ransom money. And he sends a very gracious letter in which he says to the abbot, I'm pleased to return your monks to you. I would even have granted your monastery an immunity from any raiders if you had only asked. And furthermore, I invite you to come and settle in Sicily, where I promise you will be treated with the respect that you are due. So it's a very courtly kind of exchange. It's a very courteous response that this abbot gets from the Muslim governor. And the point of this is to illustrate that piracy went on, and there were Arabs who were raiding Christian communities, and, as we're about to see, there were Vikings who were raiding up and down and taking slaves and booty as well. But piracy in this time period, although very widespread, was driven by the prospect of easy theft, of making a quick buck. It wasn't primarily motivated by some kind of religious or cultural agenda. It's just raiders would raid wherever they thought they could easily get in, get out, and make some money on their venture. So we're going to talk now about Vikings. And you may be familiar with Vikings as the sort of men who terrorized monks in monasteries because they were doing exactly the same thing that these Arab pirates were doing, sailing up in their ships, raiding monasteries, carrying off prisoners and gold and silver and relics and whatever they thought they could make money on. And you've probably heard of Vikings raiding even the city of Paris, or conquering England at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But you probably haven't heard of Vikings in Italy. But that is exactly the story that we are going to see unfold in this series, because the guys that historians start calling Normans are in fact none other than the Vikings. The word Norman comes from Norse men, or men of the north. And these are the guys who came in from Scandinavia and Denmark and Iceland, the ones that you're more familiar with as Vikings with their longboats. A little bit of time passes, and as they start spreading around Europe, they begin to be called Norsemen or Normans. So these Vikings, or Northmen, Normans, were such a problem raiding along the coasts of Europe that some of them were soon bought off by the King of France. And their leader, a guy called Rollo, was offered a deal where he and his Normans could settle in a part of France, and they would acknowledge the King of France as their overlord, but their job would be to protect that coastal region from other raiding Norsemen just like them. So Rollo and his band of Northmen, or Normans, settle in this part of France, which is then called Normandy. You know, the same Normandy of D-Day. It gets its name from these guys who settled there. These same ruthless fighters, the Normans, were now building their own domains in parts of France and indeed England, carving out their little territories and calling themselves dukes and counts. They were ruling over the existing population of Franks, who many historians will identify as sort of the ancestor people of the French and Germans both. But when the Normans settle in France, they are there to stay, and they become very much embedded in the politics of Europe from the 900s onward, and, as we shall see, a major part of the history of southern Italy and Sicily in particular. However, their contemporaries had not forgotten where they came from. Bishop Benzo of Alba, writing in 1090, says, quote, "Instead of Normans, it would be better to call them non-persons, nolimani, the most foul-smelling rubbish in the world, sons of filth, tyrants who have risen from the rabble." And the bishop's views were not isolated. Many of their contemporaries had not forgotten that the Normans or Northmen had been a bunch of pirates on ships, nothing more than brigands and robbers. And so even though in many parts of Europe they were establishing settled communities and giving themselves titles of nobility, a lot of people said, we know exactly who you are, and we haven't forgotten where you came from. So many people in the upper classes of Europe looked down on the Normans, and as a result, the quest for legitimacy and recognition haunted them. The Normans were known for being tall. They had pale skin and fair or reddish hair. They were also commonly blue-eyed or gray-eyed. They were strong and especially quick to adapt their fighting methods. And this may have been the secret sauce that made the Normans so effective, because they begin as ship-borne raiders. But very quickly, they master things like the art of the cavalry charge, which is a bunch of mounted men on horseback maneuvering as a group in order to conquer other people fighting on foot or even other mounted warriors. So cavalry charge is a very different military set of tactics. It requires different equipment and a totally different skill set. But the Normans are rapidly able to adapt to the need to develop that skill, and they do it very well. They also innovate things like siege towers. So remember, we're talking about the 900s, the 1000s, and the 1100s, this period of our story. So we're getting into the middle part of the Middle Ages, and siege warfare is a really important part of that. You see a lot of towns or fortresses where you have these legendary castles with enormously thick walls and slit windows where archers wait to shoot at people who are approaching. And in order to conquer such fortresses, castles, or fortified towns, you needed to be good at siege warfare. So to develop a mobile siege tower that would allow you to quickly roll up to a castle wall or a fortification wall, get your guys up that tower in a hurry and over the wall, was a game-changing tool to have. And the Normans get to grips with this very quickly. They also change their gear in very distinctive ways. By the 900s, they're known for wearing a lighter type of chainmail than many other fighters, including the Byzantines and the Arabs. So it effectively protects them, but it doesn't weigh them down as much. And they're also known for their distinctive long almond-shaped shields, which again were very effective, but they were adapted differently than the shields that other warriors at the time were carrying. So it wasn't just that they were tall, it wasn't just that they had reddish hair and blue eyes, but they also had a knack for quickly developing the skills and technologies they needed to thrive, whether they were moving by ship or on land. Some of the earliest reports of Normans in southern Italy come in the year 1016. These Normans came from the part of France called Normandy, and they spoke Old French. Now, since the Normans had been living in France, they'd been trying to get legitimate. So, as I've already mentioned, the more successful among them were giving themselves titles such as Duke and Count, and they had also converted to Christianity. So, at least outwardly, they were practicing the Latin or Western form of Christian worship. As a result of this, they did things like making pilgrimages, visiting Jerusalem. And this group of Normans that shows up in southern Italy have been doing exactly that. Their trip to Jerusalem is, of course, motivated in part by religious reasons, but they also had some other more pragmatic motivations as well. If you were a young Norman man and you didn't happen to have the great good fortune of being your father's firstborn son, then you were not going to inherit whatever territory your father had managed to make his own. That would usually be passed to the firstborn son. So if you were a second, a third, a fourth, or a fifth son, you were going to have to seek your fortune and your plot of land elsewhere. And so there are these groups of young Normans who are traveling, they're going to the Holy Land, but they're also looking for adventure. They're looking for other opportunities. And it's a group of Normans such as this, on their return from Jerusalem, heading back home to Normandy in France, that stops off at a religious shrine in southern Italy. And while they're there, they encounter this Lombard nobleman. Now, the Lombards were another sort of Germanic tribe that had come into Italy much earlier, and many of them had quite successfully set up their own little duchies and kingdoms all across southern Italy. And the Lombards were fighting against the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, for control over parts of Italy, and had been quite successfully carving off chunks of Italy for themselves. But this particular Lombard is in the southern part of Italy, which has been closer to Constantinople and easier for the Byzantine Emperor to send troops to reinforce. And so he's been under Byzantine rule, and he'd like to be free of it. So at this shrine, he sees some 40 young Norman knights there, and he says, "These are exactly the sort of men that I need. If I could get a bunch of guys that look just like this, tall, strong, very effective looking warriors, I could get rid of my problems with the Byzantines and I could be independent. So he approaches the Normans and he makes them an offer. He says, look, guys, I have a job for you. if, if you come back with me to where I live, we have some fighting to do, but I'll pay you really well. And the Normans say, well, we're kind of in a hurry to get home. It takes a long time in 1016 to get from France to Jerusalem and back again. They've been on the road for months. But they say, you know what? You're making a good offer. Let us go home. Let us talk to a few of our friends. And in some months' time, next year, during fighting season, we'll come back with a bunch of our friends and you'll have the military muscle that you need. So this group of Normans has again returned from Jerusalem. And this is not an uncommon thing. I mean, pilgrimage was extremely popular in the Middle Ages. Thousands of people did it every year. So this group of Normans is coming back through southern Italy on their way home, and they're being hosted by the Christian ruler of Salerno. During their stay, Salerno, which is right on the coast, is attacked by a bunch of Saracen or Arab pirates. And the population, which is quite accustomed to these raids, is very terrified. So that they're not putting up much resistance. They're kind of ducking and covering and hiding as these pirates swarm off the ships and are beating people and taking whatever movable wealth they can find. So the Normans, who are watching this as guests of the ruler of that city, are so disgusted by what they see in front of them that they immediately grab their own weapons and just wade into the fray. And they start slashing and crushing heads and inflicting injuries. And the population, who see this group of outsiders doing this, take heart. And so many of the locals begin to take up weapons and swarm in with the Normans. And there's now this drubbing going on of these pirates who are so shocked and so surprised. They're not accustomed to meeting this kind of organized, violent resistance that very quickly the ones that don't get killed are running back to their ships and trying to get out of there as quickly as possible. So there are a number of similarities between these stories. It's possible that the details of one of them have been changed. They resemble each other. It's also possible that both of them happened independently. But certainly at this period, the point is that we have Normans beginning to show up in Sicily at the invitation of locals, usually Lombards, because they are very effective fighters. And so as sort of mercenaries or paid military muscle, as they're coming through, their possible utility is not lost on the locals, and so multiple offers are made to hire these guys and sort of keep them in-house to deal with the very unstable political situation that exists in southern Italy at this time. The Normans are so popular, they're so effective as fighters, that they're soon being hired by all the major power players of Italy and sometimes end up facing off against each other on opposing sides because everybody wants some Norman muscle. So this includes local Lombard aristocrats who are sometimes ruling independently over parts of Italy or are sometimes nominally under the overlordship of the Byzantine Empire, unhappily. It includes the Holy Roman Emperor, who is, of course, located much farther north in part of what we now call Germany, but ruled over a very large territory, and he also had territorial interests in parts of Italy. The Holy Roman Emperor is a major part of the history of Italy at this time, and he's kind of his armies are called down from the north at various points by the Pope and others to settle matters in Italy. So he also has need of military muscle on the ground in Italy from time to time. So he hires Normans. We even see Normans sent to Sicily by one of their paymasters to help the Byzantines against the Arabs. Because, of course, Sicily is then ruled by the Arabs, even though it had formerly been ruled by the Byzantines, who are anxious to get it back. So even they are hiring Normans and sending them off to the island. And that military campaign actually ends up collapsing because there's a disagreement with the people paying the Normans about how much booty, how much payment is being shared out to their hired Norman soldiers. And the Normans aren't really happy with the deal that they're being given. So that campaign collapses. But the point is that the Normans end up rapidly all over Italy as a direct result of how effective they are as fighters. Everybody wants to hire them. While the Normans are present in southern Italy as mercenaries, very quickly they start trying to set up their own bases, their own fortresses, their own sort of centers where their brethren who are coming in for adventures and campaigns from France and other parts of Europe can join up with their resident Norman brethren and then be hired on various campaigns as mercenaries. Sometimes campaigns go very well, but sometimes Normans have to figure out for themselves how they're going to make a living. And they do this, as you would expect the descendants of pirates to do, by stealing and extorting and terrorizing from the local population when necessary. In many ways, the Normans begin to operate like an organized crime unit, where they will offer towns or communities the opportunity to pay for protection. And if they don't, then the Normans will just take what they want. Historian John Julius Norek reports Norman methods in southern Italy as follows. The Normans in many ways begin to operate like an organized crime unit. And they're thugs for hire, they're fighters for pay, so they'll be employed by different locals for different reasons. But between those campaigns, they also just have to find ways to feed themselves and ways to ensure a steady source of income. And they can do this by extorting food and payment from local communities and monasteries. And they do this very much in a way that incurs the resentment of these local communities, as you would expect. If you're stealing crops and stealing farm animals or going to the monastery and stealing gold and silver, you're not going to make yourself very popular. You might be surprised to think of the Normans as raiding monasteries. I mean, after all, aren't they Christians? Didn't they convert? Well, they did. But Normans didn't let the way they imagined the afterlife get too much in the way of the everyday business of getting rich and getting land. And that was ultimately their number one priority. So while Normans would identify themselves as Latin Christians, and those are the churches that they'd like to be buried in or around, it didn't really get in the way of them raiding wherever they thought would be a good place to strike. And so while they've sometimes been described as loyal to the Pope, we should understand this as basically lip service. For example, there was the time they took the Pope prisoner. So the Pope wants to visit these Christian communities in southern Italy that have traditionally been closer to the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantines. And they have their own Christian leader there, the Patriarch, the Archbishop of Constantinople. And so there's this turf war going on between the leader of the eastern half of the Christian world and the leader of the western half of the Christian world, who's the Pope, who's anxious to make himself the leader of the entire Christian world. And this is going to define Leo IX's mission. It's going to be what drives his entire term of office. And his insistence on this is going to have dire consequences. The idea of Pope, the way it exists for you and me, didn't exist at this period. The Pope was just the Bishop of Rome. He was maybe the first amongst equals. He wasn't acknowledged as the leader of the entire Christian world. He had a dominant position in the western half of the Christian world, the former Western Roman Empire, but the eastern half of the Roman Empire had its own administration, both religious and political, and they didn't think much of the Bishop of Rome, nor did they think that he was the person who should be in charge of the whole Christian community. So Pope Leo IX's insistence that his role was to be leader of the entire Christian world is going to cause some really serious problems in just 1 year's time. In 1054, there's this thing called the Great Schism, and we've done an entire series on this in Villains and Virgins podcast. You can go check it out. But in short, the eastern half of the Christian world did not accept Pope Leo IX's insistence that he be the leader of the whole Christian world. And so we see this permanent division that happens. But this is the same Leo IX, okay? So he's going into southern Italy. He's on this mission to assert himself as a leader, but he has an additional reason for going. And that is because the Normans are causing problems. The Normans were busy plundering churches and monasteries, including ones that were in territories that belonged to the Pope himself. You see, the Pope at this period is also the Prince of Rome. He has these territories that were known as the Papal States. And that means that the Pope was the feudal overlord for these territories. He collected taxes from these cities. They were his personal territory. And so the Normans were encroaching on places that paid tax to the Pope as the Prince of Rome. So this is an economic and a political designation. He holds it in addition to his religious duties, but it should be understood as something that's additional, not integral. So, in short, the Normans are hitting the Pope where it hurts, which is in the purse strings, and they are threatening areas that pay taxes directly to him. There are reports at this time of people coming to visit the Pope from southern Italy with horrific injuries. Things like having their eyes gouged out or their hands cut off. And they'd suffered these injuries as a direct result of Norman brutality. And quite naturally, because the Pope was their feudal overlord in places like Benevento, it was perfectly normal for them to appeal to him for security and protection against these incursions. So the Pope realized it was a very serious problem, and he consulted with the Holy Roman Emperor, who we've already spoken of, who was headquartered farther north in what is now Germany. And he said, listen, there's a problem. There's a long history of popes at this time period calling in military support from the Holy Roman Emperor. So Pope Leo is doing the same thing. He says, we have problems in southern Italy. You need to send an army down. I'll raise the forces that I can here. We'll go down together, and we need to eliminate these Normans. We need to put a stop to the theft and the violence and the brutality that they continue to cause. Whenever those guys come down from the north, they have a well-established reputation for sorting things out. The Pope is going to raise an army to assist the Holy Roman Emperor. In addition to that, there are plenty of Lombard nobles, cities, local communities in southern Italy that resent the Normans at this point. They're tired of being threatened, of being robbed, of being beaten. And so all of these people are more than happy to align themselves with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor to get rid of the Normans. Even worse, the Byzantine Empire, which has forever been competing with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor for control of the southern part of Italy, is actually willing to send troops to help them fight the Normans. So all of these people who previously hired Normans themselves, they've been paymasters, they've been employers of Normans, are now aligning with each other to eliminate the Normans, because the Normans have become so troublesome and so dangerous. So this moment in 1053 is one where the Norman presence in Italy might come to an end altogether. If they lose in the battle that's about to erupt, that's going to be it. The Pope begins marching down from Rome towards southern Italy. He's supposed to be joined by Frankish warriors sent by the Holy Roman Emperor. At the last minute, those warriors are recalled. They can't be spared. They can't join the campaign. There's only a contingent of German swordsmen, a fairly small contingent, about 700 by some reports, that he's able to send. So these guys are from Swabia in southern Germany, and that's a region we've talked about in the series on the Peasants' War some 500 years later. But this is 1053, so they're from the same region, but at a considerably earlier period. They're very, very tall, considerably over 6 feet. So even the Normans, who are notable for their height, look shorter than these guys. They're very fierce, and they fight with 2 hands on 1 sword. So they've got a very, very large, heavy sword. That is their weapon of choice. So 700 of these Swabian swordsmen come down with the Pope, but that's not an army. which means he has to recruit on the move. He has to basically come up with anyone that he can get as volunteers on his march down south. Now, when the Pope arrives, he's got a force of several thousand men, but it's smaller than the army that the Normans have ready. And even worse, it's very disorganized. He's got volunteers that he collected on the march. It's not like he has battle-hardened units that are used to working together, like the Normans. So the Normans are far better organized, and they have larger numbers than the army the Pope brings with him. But that's about to change, because if the Pope can join up with the Byzantines, then they will have a significant numerical advantage. So the Pope wants to delay fighting the Normans until he's able to join up with the Byzantines. But the Normans have very strong motivation to engage the Pope's army and fight them before the Byzantines arrive. The Normans succeed in engaging the Pope's army at the Battle of Civitate. And very quickly, Norman experience and military prowess scatters and demolishes large sections of the Pope's somewhat ragtag army. The one exception are the Swabian swordsmen, who have mocked the Normans before the battle, encouraged the Pope to go ahead and fight. We don't need to worry about these guys, we'll slaughter them all. And these Swabians are so fierce that the Normans have great difficulty overcoming them, and they fight to the very last man. In the end, the Pope's army loses, and the Normans manage to take Pope Leo IX himself prisoner. Now, they treat him very graciously. They are, after all, Christians, and so they recognize that as the Bishop of Rome, he's a fairly important personage. They treat him very, very courteously, but they decline to let him leave. In fact, he's forced to stay in Norman custody for a period of some 9 months. And during this period, he can see visitors, he can send correspondence, he's treated with extreme politeness, but he doesn't get to leave until he agrees to recognize and legitimize the Normans as possessors of all the territory that they currently hold. So in other words, the Norman lands that they've managed to seize for themselves are no longer stolen property. The Pope is going to legitimize them as the actual rulers of those lands under his feudal overlordship or his nominal authority. So the Battle of Civitate is this amazing turning point because it's a moment that could have been absolute disaster and the end of Norman presence in Italy. But instead, they end up much farther ahead than they were before it happened. Because the Byzantine army never does manage to show up. I mean, by the time they get there, it's all over. The Pope is a prisoner. So this alliance of their worst enemies doesn't end up actually working. They have the Pope. They're able to extract these concessions and recognitions. So by the time he leaves, by the time Pope Leo IX is released and escorted back to Rome, the Normans are not only there to stay, but they are recognized as legitimate land possessors. They have titles like Duke and so on. This amazing improval in Norman fortunes in Italy is made all the more obvious by an episode only a few years later in 1059, exactly 6 years after Normans had held Pope Leo IX prisoner for 9 months. The new Pope, Nicholas II, approaches the Normans to hire them. That's right. He can't think of a better and more reliable group of men to take on a military campaign, and Pope Nicholas II wants to take Sicily back from the Arabs. It's been the Emirate of Sicily for some time now, and he would like to put it back under Christian control. So you now have the Pope joining the long line of other power players in Italy who have wanted to hire Norman muscle for their military missions. The Pope approaches a Norman named Robert Guiscard. He's a member of a very significant and very effective warrior clan called the Hautevilles, originally from Normandy in France. He's been in southern Italy a long time. And the Pope says to Robert Guiscard, listen, I'm going to give you the official right to rule Sicily You can be the legitimate ruler of Sicily under my authority. There's just one catch. You have to take it from the Arabs first. And Robert Guiscard is actually happy with this deal. He says, no problem. A military campaign to Sicily, so if I get it, I get to rule that for myself. Sign me up. And so the deal is struck. A campaign begins now that is going to take decades to finish. But Robert Guiscard feels up to the task. In fact, the name Guiscard is actually a nickname that he has earned over his long years of running around in Sicily, and it means crafty or cunning. Robert Guiscard already has an established reputation as a very effective military commander, and he's confident that he can shortly begin adding Sicilian territory to the land that he already controls in southern Italy. This Robert Guiscard is a self-made man. When he arrived in southern Italy, he had nothing except a familial connection to some of his older brothers who had arrived in southern Italy from Normandy before him. And they didn't help him out particularly. They just said, join the collection of adventurous young Normans. You're going to have to make your own bones here. And that is exactly what Robert Guiscard does. And over the course of little more than a decade, Robert Guiscard is now the legitimate ruler of large parts of southern Italy, with the option of as much of Sicily as he can lay his hands on. Now, to give you an example of what kind of a guy Robert Guiscard was, he wasn't just called crafty and cunning. He wasn't just a self-made man, but he was someone who was very much an opportunist. So at about this very same time that he gets this offer from the Pope, it's about 1058, 1059 that Robert Guiscard suddenly discovers that his existing marriage is not legitimate. How does that happen, you say? Well, he apparently checked the records and discovered that he was a little bit too closely related to his wife, that she was within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity. So the church had some regulations about how closely related you could be to somebody. If you were too closely related, you couldn't legitimately marry them. And so Robert Guiscard says, oh, you know what? I've just checked our family trees, honey, and I've realized that you and I are too closely related, which means that even though we've been married for years, and even though you've produced for me a fine, strapping son by the name of Bohemond, who will show up later in our story, we've never actually legitimately been married. So I'm still a bachelor, and my son, our son, is actually a bastard because we were never really legitimately married. So I need to send you off, amicably, apparently, but he sends his wife away just in time to stabilize his power base in southern Italy by marrying the daughter of a powerful Lombard aristocrat. So as you've been picking up, if you've been following this story, the Lombards have been existing power players in southern Italy for a long time. They were some of the first guys who invited Normans in and hired them, and they have their own existing kingdoms and territories. And in order for Robert Guiscard to campaign effectively in Sicily, he needs to make sure that things in southern Italy stay nice and quiet while he's away. And making an alliance with one of his Lombard neighbors, who's also got effective military means at his disposal, is a great way to do that. So, by conveniently declaring himself a bachelor, never officially married, Robert Guiscard frees himself to take to wife a woman named Sichelgaita, who's the daughter of this Lombard aristocrat. Now, Sichelgaita, whose name I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly, probably like you, I've never heard anybody actually speak this name, but she is an incredible woman. One historian describes her as, quote, a woman of immense build and colossal physical strength. There are stories of Sichelgaita, who's the descendant of this Germanic Lombard tribe, riding into battle with her husband in full body armor, with her long hair streaming out from under her helmet. Apparently, going to war was one of her favorite activities. And given the very imposing physical build she had been blessed with, she wasn't just there to watch. Remember, this is the High Middle Ages. We're talking 1058. So, women riding around in full knightly armor, not really a common sight. But this woman apparently did. And she and Robert Guiscard were reportedly inseparable. From the time they got married, she spent all of her time with him, which might be one reason why she produced no less than 10 children over the course of their marriage, 3 of them sons. But while Sichelgaita is obviously an incredible and very unusual woman for her time, it would be unwise to imagine that this was some love match that was inspired by Robert Guiscard seeing this, female warrior on a horse and deciding he has to have her. I mean, it's very clearly a match that is motivated by canny political motivations. And the timing of it is perfect given the campaign that Guiscard is about to undertake in Sicily. So he decides that he needs to swap out one wife and take another for very important political and military reasons. And it's just his good luck that he happens to get a wife that he likes so much that he can't bear to be separated from. Robert Guiscard himself is someone that we have an actual physical description of from an eyewitness. None other than the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena, who encounters him a couple of decades later in his middle years, and she gives the following description. His stature was so lofty that he surpassed even the tallest. His complexion was ruddy, his hair flaxen, his shoulders were broad, his eyes all but emitted sparks of fire, and in frame he was well built where nature required breadth, and was neatly and gracefully formed where less width was necessary. So from tip to toe, this man was well proportioned, as I have repeatedly heard many say. Now, Homer says of Achilles that when he shouted, his voice gave his hearers the impression of a multitude in an uproar. But this man's cry is said to have put thousands to flight. Thus, equipped by fortune, physique, and character, he was naturally indomitable and subordinate to nobody in the world. Powerful natures are ever like this, people say, even though they be of somewhat obscure descent. You can see in this account, written by an imperial princess, someone who is as blue blood as they get, that she looks down on Robert Guiscard's origins, but she can't deny his incredible capacities as a leader and as a warrior, that he's self-made in every sense of the word. He comes from what she would regard as nothing and nobody, and yet he's become such an effective leader of men that he's taken over large sections of Italy and is, as we're about to see, about to go into an extended campaign in the island of Sicily as well. So he's quite a character. He's not just foxy, he's not just an opportunist, but he's being compared by the imperial princess in Constantinople to something like Achilles himself. And she was an eyewitness. So that gives you a sense of who exactly we're dealing with. The conquest project in Sicily would take the better part of 30 years, and it wasn't as straightforward as just rolling up an army on the shore and going to war. Robert Guiscard and his younger brother Roger, who's going to play a very large role in Sicily and in our subsequent episodes, are involved in this for more than 30 years. And at one point, they're even hired, shockingly, as mercenaries by one Muslim ruler in Sicily to fight against his own brother who is leading an uprising. So at this point, we've had the Lombards hiring Norman muscle. We've seen the Byzantines do it. We've seen the Holy Roman Emperor do it. The Pope is doing it. And now even Muslim rulers in Sicily are doing it. So apparently you can't get better soldiers than Normans if you can handle the pay. The success of the Normans expanding their control of Sicily over the next 3 decades was a back and forth process because they were continuously distracted by having to run back to southern Italy and quash instability and uprisings there. So Robert Guiscard, who has his base in southern Italy, and his younger brother Roger, who's going to be sort of the leader on the ground in Sicily, sometimes combine their efforts and sometimes split them up in order to manage controlling one area of Italy while trying to acquire another. The Normans capture the city of Palermo in 1072, and they do this with the help of their naval fleet, which isn't surprising given that the Normans, or Northmen, originally began as Vikings. So seaborne warfare, it comes very, very naturally to them. And Palermo didn't put up an extended resistance, largely because of the terms that the Normans offered that city. In a policy that would come to characterize their dealings in Sicily, the Normans offered the Arab inhabitants of Sicily a good deal. They said, listen, surrender to us, and you can basically keep everything more or less as it is. You can keep almost all your existing government, you can keep your religion, we can go back to business as usual. You just have to pay taxes to us, and you have to recognize one Norman governor as nominally in charge of the city. So in charge of the rest of the Muslim bureaucrats and officials who already run things. And this Norman official, we're going to call him an Amiratus, which is derived directly from the Arab word for emir, which is the title of ruler in that language. So we can see that the Normans are already utilizing the existing structures of government and the existing titles that they find on the ground in Sicily, and just kind of inserting themselves into the structures that are already there, instead of trying to tear them down and build an entirely new apparatus. And it works for them. Palermo surrenders without much of a fight. That's one city down, and a bunch more on the list yet to go. Robert Guiscard finally leaves Sicily in 1072, just after the capture of Palermo, to go back home to southern Italy and deal with uprisings there, and he leaves his younger brother Robert in charge of continuing the campaign. The remaining Normans succeed in expelling Arab rulers from the island of Sicily in 1091, and they found their own Norman dynasty in Sicily under Roger, who becomes Roger I. And so Robert Guiscard and his younger brother have divided this territory between them. Roger I gets to run Sicily, and Robert Guiscard remains in southern Italy on the mainland. Robert Guiscard has been so successful in establishing himself as the ruler of a stable and united territory in southern Italy that once again, even his worst enemies decide they need to seek his help. Robert Guiscard's territories in Apulia and Calabria were traditionally part of the Byzantine Empire. They have enormous Greek-speaking communities, and therefore when Robert Guiscard carved out these areas for himself and established himself as their ruler, he was doing so directly at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. He was taking territories that had belonged to the emperor and acquiring them for himself. So naturally, the Byzantine emperor had no love for this Robert Guiscard. I mean, he was very much an enemy for the Byzantines. However, the Normans, having established such a reputation as effective fighters, are soon sought after by the Byzantine emperor himself. So Emperor Michael VII has a very unstable grasp of power. He has enemies. He's worried about a coup or an uprising, and so he could use some Norman military support. And in order to do this, he proposes an alliance. He actually contacts Robert Guiscard, his old enemy in southern Italy, and he says, listen, how about we marry your daughter to my son? And that way we have a family connection, and if I need military help, you'll supply it. So Robert Guiscard sends his daughter Helen to marry the son of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, modern-day Turkey. That is an enormous ascent in the world for the daughter of a brigand, basically the daughter of a thief and a mercenary. But her father, Robert, has been so successful, he's so effective, he's so legitimate now, that his daughter is actually going to marry the son of the Byzantine emperor himself. If that's not a sign of how far the status of the Normans has changed in Italy, I'm not sure how much clearer it gets. And this status change is a direct result of Norman military effectiveness and political cunning. Unfortunately, this glorious moment was not to last. The emperor's enemies did in fact succeed in overthrowing him, and they took Robert Guiscard's daughter Helen and imprisoned her in a monastery. Helen's father, Robert Guiscard, now saw the ultimate quest unfold before him. He would sail to Constantinople with the goal of rescuing his daughter, of protecting his southern Italian territories from any possible Byzantine threat, and the best way to do that would be to crown himself Emperor of Byzantium, Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. Robert immediately begins building the navy that he knows he's going to need, and in 1083 begins his campaign. Initially, it goes very well. His army defeats the Byzantine army and their Venetian allies in the first confrontation they have. So his campaign to get into Constantinople is underway and it's heading in the right direction. Unfortunately, it's interrupted by a desperate call for help from none other than the Pope. So Robert Guiscard, on campaign heading for Constantinople, receives an emergency summons from Pope Gregory VII. Now, this particular pope and Robert Guiscard weren't even particularly friends. Pope Gregory VII had even excommunicated Robert Guiscard at one point, so they didn't have a friendly relationship, these two men in particular. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The Pope was in trouble with the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, who was currently marching an army down from Germany and threatening to take over Rome and also put all of southern Italy under his control, the Holy Roman Emperor's control. So the Pope is sending this emergency message to Robert Guiscard saying, listen, my enemy is your enemy. If the Holy Roman Emperor comes down with this army and takes over Rome, that's bad for me. But if he takes over southern Italy, that's bad for you too. So you better bring your army right back to Italy as quickly as you can. And of course, Robert Guiscard doesn't fail to see the logic of this summons. He turns his army around, sails back to Italy, and dispatches the army of the Holy Roman Emperor back to where they came from. He manages to squash the rebellious nobles in southern Italy who were aligning with the Holy Roman Emperor and defeat the Frankish army within 1 year, which is astonishing. And with that done, he turns his attentions back to the east and prepares to continue his campaign towards Constantinople in the next fighting season. By 1085, in the following season, Robert Guiscard is heading back towards Constantinople. He's on this campaign, and much to the relief of the Byzantines, no doubt, he dies quite suddenly of a fever on his way to attacking yet another Greek city. Now, what is amazing to note here is not just that this guy is so effective that he's been sought after by the Byzantine emperor, who's his enemy, as well as this particular pope, who's no friend of his. He's being called on for military help from all directions. But at this moment in his life, he's heading towards his most ambitious goal yet, which is to make himself emperor. He's marching at the head of an army. He's on campaign. He's sleeping in a tent and riding on a horse and eating military food like everybody else. And he's 70 years old. So at a point in his life when most people are sitting by the fire, counting their laurels and thinking back to their glory days of old, Robert Guiscard is chasing with all his force the biggest and most ambitious prize of a very long and ambitious life. It's an incredible arc, and it's fortunate for the Byzantines that he was struck down by a fever. Otherwise, history might have turned out very differently. While Robert Guiscard failed in his final quest, he left a remarkable legacy. The middle child of a Norman family in France, he had carved out his own duchy in southern Europe, and with his brother Robert, begun the conquest of Sicily, which his brother Robert completes in 1091. It took 30 years, but the Normans finished the job, expelling Arab rule from Sicily and taking the island over for themselves. While Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger were not kings in title, they went by the titles of dukes, They were kings in every other respect but name. They were in Italy to stay, but they remained aware of their status as outsiders in a country that had very mixed populations, languages, and cultures. And because of this, wherever they went, they conducted their politics of rule with a much lighter hand than they had employed when they just operated as mercenaries, brigands, and thieves. The policies that they began in Sicily, where they allowed existing populations to maintain their own structures of government, worship, and community, was a policy that they were going to continue. And it's one reason why the century ahead, from 1091 to 1194 in Sicily, is going to be the period of Norman rule, but also a period of flourishing, a period where we see an incredible creation, a cultural synthesis, which is remarkable in the history of the world. We're going to see official documents issued in 3 languages: Greek, Latin, and Arabic, once the Normans take over and begin their rule in Sicily. There are Latin Christians who derive the legitimacy of their rule from the Pope, but they're also going to be patrons of Greek Orthodox Christian monasteries, and they're going to encourage Muslim communities and employ Muslims in their military and at court. The Normans remain very much in demand as military muscle outside of Italy as well. And just remember, these Normans are none other than the Vikings. And at this point, by the end of the 1000s, we've seen them settle in France. We've seen them invade and take over in England in 1066. We've seen them take over most of southern Italy, as well as the island of Sicily. And we're going to see them go into the Holy Land itself. And it's none other than a young Norman by the name of Bohemond who founds the Crusader state of Antioch in the Holy Land. And it shouldn't surprise us to learn that this Bohemond is the very same bastard son of Robert Guiscard, who was delegitimized when his father got rid of his mother so that he could marry Sichelgaita. But that is another story. Clearly, Bohemond inherited all of his father's military daring, but our story is going to stay with the Normans in Italy, with Robert Guiscard's brother Roger I, who has now founded a Norman dynasty in Sicily, and with the incredible way that legacy is continued by his son, Roger II. This is the story of the Normans in Sicily. And if you've enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode and the one after that in this series as we track this incredible story. You're also warmly invited to join me on Patreon if you want to be part of the after episode chat for this episode and all the ones to come. If you've enjoyed this, please consider sharing it with someone else that you think would enjoy this story of Crusaders, Knights, Vikings, and pirates. See you in the next episode.